I think, to first develop a healthy, confident sense of self, an integral sense of self, and also admitting that none of us are going to be totally, fully harmonious and aligned within ourselves. We're going to have disparate subminds and conflicting worldviews and unaligned drives, and that's okay. And we can admit that and acknowledge it to ourselves, and that's actually a really good thing to do, actually, to recognize where you're at odds with yourself. Yeah, and then there's this process, I think, of from a having a healthy sense of self, and then you can deconstruct that sense of self.
Alrighty, welcome everybody. It's the Shaman here coming at you with my good friend Roger. Thanks for being here, Roger.
Good to be here with you.
So basically, Roger is another fellow ninja on the path. We've been having chats about consciousness, transformation, masculinity, society, worldviews, and many things for a long time. Roger is quite an accomplished, let's say, observer, practitioner, and teacher of various types of consciousness management through meditation techniques and also understanding lots of different maps of the world, I think. So he's going to be a very rich and interesting person to have on the call today. Roger's also a man who's on his own independent journey of masculinity and somebody that I would definitely call a liberated man as well. So thanks for being here and very excited to see what we can discover as we talk.
Yeah, thank you for that intro. I'm really curious to get into this with you.
Wonderful. Well, I think in terms of dropping in a little bit, do you want to give a little bit of a background, perhaps, just to get yourself into a bit of a context about, what is it that you're up to in your life at the moment, and where are you kind of
Hmm.
positioning yourself in terms of like what's your interests and focuses at the moment, and then maybe we can build from there.
Yeah. I think one place I'm at is a process of individuation
Hmm.
after a very long pre-process of exploring the self and finding it empty and all those things, and sort of integrating in with sort of wider field of awareness, and then being able to simultaneously become more of my individual. So having gone through quite strong frameworks of Buddhism and being very informed by those teachings, and then kind of, for me, reaching a satiation in
Hmm.
them, and then finding from a place of well understanding, but where do I dare to disagree? And then going off and carving my own path. And yeah, this is sort of formulating in. I'm very into phenomenology and sort of comprising how do I make sense of perceptual reality, how it's constructed, different ways of slicing the proverbial pie.
Hmm.
And now I'm kind of a man, uh, somewhat adrift in the world, kind of just been traveling a lot the last
Hmm.
few months. Don't have a strong home base, finding my place, and yeah, seeing what's arising. And it's been really interesting to travel so far away from my home country in the UK. I'm now all the way around the other side of the planet in New Zealand, but after spending some months in Southeast Asia and such like that, the kind of the further away I go from there, the more contrast I find with the local environment makes my individual self stand out more. Although there's a funny thing with coming to New Zealand, which is almost like this copycat sort of pasted island of the UK in a way. It's, British settlement and these things sort of same but different. So yeah, going away from home has been really interesting to see, to find more of my Britishness, actually, which
Hmm.
I wasn't expecting. Yeah.
That is interesting, isn't it? I guess, you go to the other side of the world to find other people who have a certain semblance of that quality because is it that you find that you see certain characteristics of that type of culture around you, or what is it that makes you find your Britishness in New Zealand?
It's it's subtle things. It's like my accent and my disposition and my like wherever I go, I've been trying to find baked beans in cans, to eat from. It's
Mm,
like as a comfort food, like when I'm sick of eating greasy noodles in
mm,
Asia or something like that.
mm,
So
mm.
kind of these subtle things and ways in which um quite strong characteristics of myself have stood the test um of location, of geographical location. Yeah.
Absolutely. I got you. Well, something that
Yeah.
catches my interest with talking to you is, you mean you're somewhat of an inner type of wizard yourself, and this idea of phenomenology and, understanding the inner landscapes. I think in some sense, if you misunderstand it, it could seem quite boring, but in reality, it's actually quite action-packed to be a kind of inner versal kind of explorer. So do you want to talk a little bit about like what
Mm.
phenomenology and what spirituality and maybe what the mission has been for you and why you are kind of fascinated with that in a real kind of practical way?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and if I had to make sense of one of the main things my kind of mind does,
Hmm.
is try to model minds as a whole. It's trying to model my own mind and model other people's minds. So, it's given me amazing like flexibility of mental states, of trying to inhabit other cognitive dispositions and sort of really grow my theory of mind abilities to empathize and understand more and more where other people are coming from. So I do this by default. Like when I meet people, try to give them the benefit of the doubt and understand why do they say and do the things that they are doing. So that is a proclivity. I found the world and people quite overwhelming. And so then I'm drawn to spending a lot of time by myself. I sort of have this introverted nature in that way, and then trying to make sense of what are some universal qualities of mind I can find in myself, and then find them in others. And yeah, subsequently, I've devoted thousands of hours to meditation and training particular faculties of perception. And what's emerged from all of that training is um, a sensicality, a wider sensicality of how the kind of the physics of consciousness, how phenomena tend to behave irrespective of the individual and their sort of personal, biographical, psychological makeup in
Mm,
ways.
mm,
Yeah, yeah, but phenomenology is if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it's the study of consciousness from the first person perspective. So we're trying to find a kind of objectivity of subjectivity and imagine you you know nothing about the wider world. You know nothing about neuroscience or physics or history or any of these things, and you have to just kind of learn from your first person experience. What is it like to be you? What is it like to be conscious? What's going on?
interesting. Yeah. And I guess that opens up a whole can of worms about, what is reality, what is meaning, what is our own
Yeah.
sense of perception, etc. Uh, so to zoom back a little bit, right? So something that we can kick off here is thinking about like humanity is looking for meaning all the time, and especially for men looking for purpose, looking for a sense of direction. And in many ways, we're looking for, a sense of like, let's say, agency, perhaps, or a context of selfhood, so that we can have like a feeling of safety and security. And it also makes sense that, if we have a sense of knowledge about our environment, if we have a sense of knowledge about our purpose and our relationship to the world, then that gives a certain level of continuity and repetitivity that then we can potentially extend into with more playfulness or more exploration of like higher levels of pursuit. So it's like we can become more of these people that are not so worried about our physical survival or our existential kind of concerns. Then we become a bit more emotionally stable and maybe start to think about our purpose and start to think about our expression and maybe turning life
Mm.
into some more of a type of an art form rather than a kind of survival system. And now we live in a time where, the ability to live a comfortable life is in some sense both kind of easier than ever, but at the same time, sometimes more of a rat race than ever. And I think that leaves a lot of men feeling a little bit lost and lonely and powerless in their capabilities of, being able to navigate through the world with effectiveness. And I think this is oftentimes where they start leaning into finding knowledge, and particularly in our very knowledge-rich environment, they can watch YouTube, they can get into books, they can find different information on the internet, and then they can very quickly start to pick up a type of, philosophical alignment of some kind. And especially for me, like for example, to drop in on the kind of work that I've been doing for the last 18 years, I've essentially been creating types of like roadmaps, if you will, or some field technology, some field guides for men that are navigating through their journey of wanting to express themselves in the social sphere or in their sense of identity and in their sense of direction, despite perhaps being overlooked in their ego development at stages by other people or having a lack of role models or a lack of, let's say, capable support around them to help their nervous systems to evolve. So then it becomes more about like how to move through that type of territory, how to become more effective in the face of this type of existential chaos that a lot of us are facing. So, with that being said, I think that this is all culminating in a type of like a meaning crisis that we're looking at. And in many ways, we're all dealing with a lot of contradictory ideas and a lot of messy concepts, and maybe being a little bit lost inside of the layers of how all of this stuff kind of fits together into our lives as men and as people who are trying to make sense. So what I like of your approach is that you're approaching it from a systematic kind of scientific consciousness level, which I think is a very nice way to start to approach the problem, because we're looking at it, as you said, from a primary position of, you're the main user, let's say, you're the main player, and inside of that you're exploring like what exactly is the phenomena, the universal truth, etc. And to bring it back to something that's really interesting is like, if a man, I believe, wants to be capable and powerful in his life, and in particular, if he wants to be able to show up in the world and magnetize people to him, particularly women, for example, if he wants a partner or if he's interested in being attractive, then coming from a sense of like universal principality, universal alignment, universal strength, universal like capability inside of his own mind body frame, let's say, his own sense of self, tends to
Mm.
give him a ground or a foundation or a type of like a solidity to his beingness, which if he's not careful could become, let's say, distracted or maybe even hijacked by some of these false mainstream types of ideals that in many ways are all about, chasing sexy G-string asses or making lots of cash to be successful or avoiding conflict and discomfort by just sitting at home and watching Netflix and playing video games and watching porn and eating sugar forever or whatever. So, all of that I think is quite let's say a context that we're operating from, and I just wanted to open that up as a bit of a container for us to explore here, and see where we go from there, and then also to see as we continue, maybe we can play with a little bit more practicality as well. So I'll just pass the ball back to you and see what you've got to say about any of that. But yeah, let's see
Yeah.
what we can open up here that's going to be fun and practical as well as deep and meaningful for our guys out there.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of good stuff. I mean, what comes up for me in that on that front is I think men in particular have a remarkable ability to insource as opposed to outsource a lot of their resource, and that can be to our benefit and our detriment. So we have this amazing potential to really go inside and feel deep sort of wells of peace and such. But then that can lead to a lot of isolation, and then we become these lone wolf characters in the world, and we're separated, atomized from our greater brotherhood. Men, I think, because we're stronger at that than women, we can therefore like deprive ourselves for longer and go into our dungeons, deeper, and we're less sort of clamming out into the world or reaching out in these ways. But when the greater society is not attending to our deeper needs and is not feeding us in those ways, like to what degree can we find self-worthiness, self-respect, self-love, even if it's not being given to us by greater society? I think there's a lot of potential there, but then to not stay in that place, to find those resources, but not stay in that place, and then go out into the world and give back, but also raise a flag and in some ways point out how we're not being resourced as well.
I love that. So let's have a bit of a think from a practical level, right? So we've got these guys that are out there, hopefully listening to our dialogue, and we're really wanting to put them into the more of the seat of the practitioner of their own reality, the practitioner of their own focus, the practitioner of their own capabilities, so that they can make sense of the world. Now, there's a lot we could say, and probably a lot of different models and capabilities that you could start to point towards developing inside of an individual. But for example, I would suggest that maybe one thing that we could drop into is the idea that consciousness is a type of, let's say, universal substance that we can work with. Something that has maybe like a mirror-like nature, perhaps, or a way that it can be somewhat programmed from its like free, let's say, uncontained state into some type of framed, contained, intentionalized attention of some kind or whatever. So with that being said, if we look at it like, okay, we have this experience of humanity, we have this experience of masculinity, and we're working with consciousness. Like, do you have any like general, let's say, beginner advice of like a young Jedi wanting to wake up to his capabilities a little bit and to see like who he can be so that he can feel himself being found inside of this existential vacuum?
Mm, mm. Great, great question. I mean, consciousness is certainly a shared property of all beings that have consciousness, and then we can find what, kind of more raw qualities it has, of which we can tune into and highlight. Part of that being cohesion as a whole. There's this screen of a 3D, 4D experience that, even though can seem pretty whirly and chaotic, there is on a larger frame a cohesion to it, like a wholeness to it, that if that can be found, that it seems like kind of one experience space in a way.
Mm.
So, I mean, even that might be in some ways advanced, but also very something simple to point to and find within oneself. I think that might be a nice place to start. That's what's coming up for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you
Well,
think?
what brings to my mind is this idea of presence training, right? So I've kind of coined this term, which is not particularly original, but it is this sense of like, how do we become trained in our presence? And there is a certain like focus or series of things that this comes from. Now, something that I would like to put forth, I guess, is that as we are going into this subject matter deeper, and as people listen and they get curious about what it is that we're talking about, that we can all start to get connected to a little bit of an exploration of what is the purpose of the identity, which is kind of an interesting thing in itself. What is identity of being somebody that is like a consciousness practitioner, someone that is, let's say, a wizard inside of their own capability of seeing and feeling and understanding themselves in the world. And we could have different archetypes for that type of role. And maybe, for example, we could think about it like being somebody who is like uh, someone who's intentionally living their life, or someone who is like conscious, right? Somebody who is being like more of a like a directed and maybe mature type of person. So we could start to look at it from a level of like there's different ways in which the world can slice and make sense of this type of like identity of somebody who is using tools of awareness, tools of presence, tools of understanding the world through these different frames of spirituality, whether that's, psychological or more, say, metaphysical and energetic, or maybe even more like spiritual and looking at it from more of this kind of shamanic layers, for example, or even maybe zooming out and looking at it from like an informational kind of cybernetic layer as well. So we can actually understand that there's all these ways in which we can like shape and flavor the paradigms, let's say, because ultimately what we're doing is building a paradigm, building a toolkit of what it looks like, sounds like, and feels like to make sense of the world through a particular type of lens. And I think as you're skilled at, and as I'm somewhat skilled at, this isn't about an ability to understand that we are both the creator of a view as well as the
Hmm.
observer of the view. And in many ways,
Hmm.
having a sense of like, what does it mean to be the viewer of the view as well as the practitioner inside of the experience of the view. And that's an interesting phenomenon, like this kind of quantum view of spaciousness and maybe having no particular self, which you could say is somewhat associated with, things like the Eastern technologies of Buddhism or yogic technologies. But at the same time, there is also this flip side of condensing down into a self, into a form, into an identity and an entity that is highly functional and highly capable. And even in the Eastern practices, as much as they go into those non-dual states, there does seem to be this type of artifact of a master who's like somebody who is a solid entity that is able to actually pierce and be strong and in many ways be this type of like strong focus. So what I'm sort of throwing the idea around here is that as a person that really wants to understand the world through a little bit more of let's call it an executive position of control of their consciousness, somebody who wants to understand how reality is actually like operating through them and as them in a way, then it's important to start to pick up a type of understanding of identity, an understanding of what it means to be a conscious entity. And therefore we can start to like build a certain roadmap moving forwards. Now, I'm going to breach into some of that more in terms of like what that could look like with different archetypes or different paradigms in a moment. But once again, I just want to bounce that back to you and see like, how do you feel about what I just set up there?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a range of ways of viewing that are very helpful in all of this and associated practices to get into those ways of viewing. And there's something to be said about, mapping the territory to be able to then become familiar with those different loci of operations, and then from there developing the flexibility to play with them depending on, accustomed to the needs of the times and what's
Mm,
going to serve you. But to not overwhelm people, I really would uh, take this one at a time. So starting from first getting in touch with what are your what are your deep-seated wants? So I like this practice of find anything that you want in life. It could be, you just want a sandwich right now, and then asking yourself, well, why do you want it? And then, okay, coming with an answer, oh, because I'm hungry. And then go, oh, yeah, but why do I have to satiate my hunger? Or what pleasure am I seeking? And, why is that? And then going back, 4 or 5 layers at least of why, to get in touch with sort of, yeah, some deep-seated motivations, some prime drivers in our lives. So this is a process of coming to know yourself. And then also another really simple front I like to stop people at is mapping the senses. So in all those perspectives that you laid out, They're comprised of seeing and hearing and feeling and smelling and tasting. And then you can add, thinking in there, which is mental images and mental talk and somatic sensing as well as kind of more seeing, hearing, and feeling.
Hmm.
And just taking the time to really deeply taste all of the sense channels, that those are your main ingredients in life. That's what you're working with. So no matter whatever confusing um, paradigms you've built for yourself that you don't even know that you're like locked into, this is a grounding technique. This is a way of finding sanity in an otherwise, endless ocean of um, frameworks and such. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, in some sense, well, first of all, what I'm hearing there, and this is coming from another perspective, that because I do a lot of coaching and I've trained in a lot of coaching, and one of the basic levels of coaching is to really work out, what does somebody want, right? What's their desire? And desire is one of these powerful driving
Yeah.
forces that we have in life. There's also like the surrender side of things we could talk about later, but desire is really about what do you want and why? What's going on underneath that layer. And as you said, asking those questions of like, okay, what's the goal? Is the goal to be more confident and charismatic? Is the goal to be powerful and have capabilities of fulfillment in your life? Is the goal to feel like, you're a creator and not a victim in your situation? And then why?
Mm.
Why would you like that? What would that look like? And what's important about that? So this oftentimes these chains of getting like what we could call like aligned to your values. And that's one of the most powerful things actually to start with when you're wanting to like move towards a position of more, let's say, effectiveness or creating something is an alignment of, why do you really want this? And is there let's say an integrity or a congruence in your desire into the world? And that should be something that actually gets checked as well, in the sense of like, having a desire to be powerful or to be, let's say, mature or to be fulfilled is lovely.
Hmm.
But at the same time, if it doesn't actually have the, let's say, the driving forces and the alignments of structure is a good word around it, that it's going to work, then it tends to falter or it tends to have a lot of difficulties materializing in the world. And we
Hmm.
could once again cut the cake in a lot of ways as to why that's happening. Like some people would like to talk about that from an energetic perspective. Some people might talk about that from a psychological perspective. Some people might talk about that from like a more structural, informational, or even materialistic perspective. They're all kinds of ways of, as you were saying, like pointing towards this central observer position ultimately. And I think this is key because ultimately, if we cut to the chase, this is about a person who really is going to be you, whoever's listening, being the center of your own reality. You are, in some sense, this interesting center of all things that is no center. And that sense of beingness that you are is able to organize and relate and create through its intentionality and through its focus types. And there's all types of focus types: physiological focus types, mental narrative focus types, physical action focus types. And this then starts to create different things. But in practical terms, you want to go out there and you want to get more attention from the ladies. You want to go out there, you want to make more money in the world. You want to go out there and you want to be somebody who feels more whole and healthy inside of yourself without necessarily feeling external validation as your primary force. Well, whatever the quest is, then we still have to come back to some base of practicality and agency inside of our self first. And that's what I think is like the first and foremost, like primary identity, which I think we've just talked about, is the identity of the first position of self, the identity of the creator, the chooser. In some sense, we could even start to now align that to some like extra storytelling layers of maybe we could call it the king or the sovereign or the magician, or we could start to call it something like, the practitioner or the master, right? So we start to create an identity entity layer that then can have a little bit of window dressing around it as well. Because isn't it interesting how, we can look at the world through so many different shapes and sizes, so many different colors, and so many different words and narratives. And in some sense, those narratives and words are very important because they do give the cloak of what it is that we're doing. Yet at the same time, they are still just narratives and words. And that's one of these primary paradoxes that I think we're learning to deal with in this life, is the fact that we are both, having this deep and in many ways non translatable experience at the same time as then having a lot of these words and a lot of these like stories that we are relating to the world. And that's how we tend to communicate with each other.
Amen.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, it's an important place to start from, I think, to first develop a healthy, confident sense of self, an integral sense of self, and also admitting that none of us are going to be totally, fully harmonious and aligned within ourselves. We're going to have disparate subminds and conflicting worldviews and unaligned drives, and that's okay, and we can admit that and acknowledge it to ourselves, and that's actually a really good thing to do, actually, to recognize where you're at odds with yourself. Yeah, and then there's this process, I think, of from a having a healthy sense of self, and then you can deconstruct that sense of self. I think that's a good order in which to do things, as opposed to um, being quite a mess within and then trying to slice through and deconstruct that sense of self beforehand. Then you might actually end up in a um, kind of a worse position, actually, because then you've got a heavy shadow and you'll be bypassing with this no self insight, and everything is empty, and those kind of things. So, yeah.
I got you. So, well, that's, I guess one of these things that we can run the risk of getting a little bit lost in as well. And I know myself, because just to bring it back to a little bit of storytelling, a bit of practicality. So I grew up in a way where I was both very grounded and lucky to have an environment where I had a lot of freedom. It was a very practical environment, very physical environment, growing up in like country Australia, basically. And that was a big playground to be able to experience the world. But what I lacked in that environment was, in some sense, a type of like intellectual containment or cultivation. It's not that I didn't have ideas or access to interesting information, but it wasn't really like a very rich environment about learning about my sense of self, or let's say being initiated into my reality on some level. And I was lucky enough, I think, through trial and error, and maybe just through my own internal, once again, desire and quest for meaning, to stumble into a world of, like, let's call it spiritual technology. And I first of all came across a friend of mine's mother, actually, who was like quite an accomplished psychic. She was a very natural, uh, let's say witchy type of person, not in any way that you would say is like dark or weird or anything. She was very much like this kind of, loving mother kind of figure. And she had the ability to do what was called psychometry. So psychometry is this skill of being able to hold an object and being able to read the object with great accuracy in relationship to the person and the information that it has relationship to. So she could very much like almost be like a kind of intuitive life coach, just by simply holding an object and talking about how the person was emotionally relating to the world and how their interrelations of their family or their friendships or their goals or their sense of self was impacting them. So that was a pretty interesting phenomenon to start to come into contact with when I was 16, right? So I was pretty young age to be exposed to some of those ideas, and also not just ideas, like I was experiencing like a literal magical reality, in the sense that she was able to know things and contact information fields, let's say, that were kind of secret, right? Things that weren't necessarily obvious or public, or things that were very personal, and in many ways gave a very like deep and meaningful like context to what was otherwise a little bit of an unknown experience, or let's say an unsure experience inside of myself. So that opened me up to these ideas of things like kind of new
Yeah.
agey reality, right? And then new agey reality was a good start for me, because then I could do things like, okay, let's play with the concept of energy. Let's play with the concept of expanded worldviews. What if the world is made up of different dimensionalities? What if the world does have different types of consciousness? What if there are different types of entities out there? So then I started to think about this idea of, well, maybe there are such things as like different dimensional beings or alien beings or different channelings or different spiritual layers of things. So I was already stepping into this world of like layers of different worldviews. Now, at the same time, I always had this sense of skepticism about that because it was like this thing of like I'm curious and I'm open. Let's say I'm agnostic. I believe, but I don't know anything other than what I actually can experience directly. So I'm going to give it the opportunity to prove itself to me. At the same time, I'm not going to just believe something because it's written on the box. So that gave me this kind of idea of like starting to explore deeper into the rabbit hole of paradigms and realities, etc. And then they quickly started to escalate over time. So I learned a bunch of skills that were quite interesting skills, like let's say the Reiki healing, or this other technique called Sekhem, which was also like an Egyptian variation of an energy healing technique. And then I started to get more into being curious about yogic systems. So chakras, energy fields, like different like frameworks inside the body. And then that was very interesting too, because when you understand the world, particularly from a perspective of like, let's say the chakras, like the Eastern chakra model, which says in some sense is like seven spheres of energy in the body. Each one has a corresponding color. Each one has a corresponding capability in terms of a personality, and they actually also correlate to like the endocrine system in a way. So it starts to create this quite integral type of worldview. And that was my sort of baby experience of integral type of thinking, like holistic type of thinking. And then
Hmm.
that really opened me up to this very interesting exploration of like, well, if I can understand the world as these slices of correspondences, now I can see things not just as black or white, not just materialistic, like reductionist kind of like stories. As a matter of fact, I can experience them as these types of interrelated systems. So it's like systems thinking starts to emerge. Now, once
Hmm.
again, keep in mind, I'm a 16, 17-year-old kid starting to enter into these ego layers of systems thinking, of integral thinking, and in many ways, I started to open my mind, and especially coming from the position at the time, which was not really having any particular strong direction of desire to want to go into university to become somebody that university could give me an identity, or not really wanting to go into any particular position of an identity that the mainstream society could provide for me. I wasn't interested in getting a house or becoming a father or becoming someone who was going to pick up a career. I didn't want to work in a trade. My father was a mechanic and I didn't find that to be very appealing. I didn't want to work in a corporation. I didn't trust corporations and large faceless entities that didn't have an interest in the individual. And in many ways, I was kind of in this no man's land. And the only place that really made sense for me was to have some type of spiritual refuge or a refuge in these paradigms. And then, in many ways, going into the knowledge of what it could mean that the world is not just a programmed mainstream society. It's not just a bunch of colonial thinking layers, It's not just a bunch of like programmed ideologies and dogmas. It has these more subtle levels. And then that led me to start to explore things like Chinese medicine and massage, and then Eastern thought. And then I very quickly started to become a practitioner of these types of arts. And then that led me into this world of body work and understanding holistic health. So then I was doing comparative analysis too. Like, why do the Indians say this and the Chinese say this? Why is there chakras and meridians? How do these things fit together? Why are the Taoists talking in this way and, the yogis are talking in this way? Now, why are the Buddhists saying this thing? And then the Confucianists are saying this thing, and the scientists are saying this thing. So it all becomes these different, like, sort of jumble and juggle of different things that became like a sort of an opening of different paradigm shifts that became quite interesting to me. Now, there's a lot more to say, but essentially, one of the things that really got me when I was young, I was very lucky to say, I could almost say I was like bitten by this kind of snake. And what I was bitten by was this initiatory knowledge, this knowledge that hit me when I was about 17 or 18, that the world is actually a bunch of story layers that are built on principles of actual truth. And then I started to realize, wow, like that's magic. Magic is this interface between consciousness and human experience and will and reality and feedback loops. And I'm not talking about magic of pulling rabbits out of hats and illusionists. I'm talking about the magic of consciousness being able to interrelate with matter to be able to create different types of phenomena, manifestations, reactions, or also let's say, the high magic of the effect of consciousness affecting itself to unfold itself into new forms and functions of, let's say, destiny, or the low magic of being able to create shifts in the subconscious, for example, that then might mean strength in personality or capabilities to express yourself or capabilities to have more power as a public speaker or more money or even get more girls or whatever it is that you want. So all that came together into this like search for magic, this search for truth through the lens of this kind of universal spiritual phenomena. And there's a lot more I could say, but I'll drop off at the point where that became my lens of what I would say is like my own type of like chaos magic. And I'll talk about what that means next, but it was like my own way of understanding the world as a series of layers and truths that were larger than my conscious mind or even my subconscious mind's full comprehension and understanding of what it was. But nonetheless, still seeking and being open to the possibility that this chaos can be learnt from, adapted to, and in many ways maybe even is the platform of life that's more accurate and true than, let's say, some platform of being a career orientated, mainstream kind of person that believes in a particular type of ideology. So big rant there. I just wanted to drop that in because now it starts to personalize, gives a bit of
Yeah,
story,
amazing.
a bit of narrative. And now, we can play around with that and maybe you can share a bit about your experience and your journey.
Well, I find the epistemics really cool there and how you went through that process with this initiation phase and being exposed to that witchy like woman. And I think that is the catalyst for a lot of people opening their minds up to this potential of radically different ways of viewing reality that come with different value systems and different metaphysical presumptions get unloaded onto these things. And then, I mean, you've been at this for decades, so it can take a really long period um, to explore the range of potential ways of relating, and often finding their limits. So, people are often particularly sort of rigidified into a paradigm, be it an analytical, materialistic, rationalist way of making sense of reality, and then that's their way of interpreting whatever they encounter, and they will have many blind spots and these kind of things, and then you got to get to a period of just satiating, of just reaching like the limits of this way of seeing it, that it can't account for anything, and that period might be longer or shorter for people because especially if you're like particularly high IQ and you've got a lot of mental horsepower, you can devote so much cognitive energy into really horizontally exploring a particular paradigm, but you're not developing vertically in these ways of constructing and deconstructing layers of abstraction and certain things. So I mean, I've been at this life cycle for less long than you, but it's been a process where I think around 15 as well, I became conscious that I was seeing the world in a different way each year. Basically, my models of reality were deconstructing and reconstructing, and every year since then, it's been every year I see the world in a different way. I unlock, yeah, so I break through limiting beliefs and find new ways of modeling things. And it's a crazy it's a crazy ride, and it can lead to um yeah, finding a new framework in which to understand things. You go, okay, cool. Here's the taxonomy and the map, and I've got the map and the listings, and there's like level one, level two, and of course I'm at level 10. Compared to all the normies that are only at level three, and you put your and then you realize like, oh, actually maybe I've got a lot of like shadow stuff to work on, and I'm not as advanced as I can. And then you find kind of parallels in other systems, like you're saying. And then at some point, I think there can be also an oversaturation of doing the multimodal system comparing types of analysis of like purely trying to um, make sense of reality through models. And there's the kind of the meta model, the models of models sort of view of things that it's all models all the way down.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, there are limits to, I think, doing this trying to do these one-to-one comparisons between the frameworks, because realizing, oh no, they are actually quite um, culture context specific, and maybe you'll never fully understand like where the Theravadins were coming from, 1,000 years ago, and these things. Um, but I think you were getting onto something quite interesting. What are some particularly stable principles of life, or a stable seeming truths of the way things tend to go, that independent of geographical location, culture, and time and historical period. And maybe there's some interesting things to point out there between masculinity and femininity. Um, you know,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I like about this, right, if we start to look at this from a more freestyle angle, is that when we reduce it all down, as I was saying before, this is really about becoming some type of creative agent in your own narrative, or a creative, let's say, observer inside of a creation. So therefore, there it's based on this first principle of being aware, and not just aware as a passive like receiver of events, but being aware as somebody who has some sense of capability. And this comes back to some really powerful things. In many ways, we could call this like spiritual warriorship, right? So this is our first orientation, I think, also is moving from boy to warrior, which means like I'm picking up the tools. Like, what does the boy do when he's out in the wild and the wolf comes for him? He picks up a stick, and now all of a sudden he's a warrior, right? He's got a tool, he's got a weapon, and he's got a will, and he has to do something with that reality. Now, what that also
mm,
means is that we need to create a position inside of the world to be able to have agency. And therefore, the first stage is like, how are we going to move in the world with some intent, some will, and some focus? And this is all about like becoming somebody who's a liberated person in the long run. And hopefully, we get that seed early. So what that means is like if we have enough pain and we have enough intelligence, we kind of understand that there's a path and we need to get on that path. Now, this is something, and I'm going to, paraphrase it badly, but like, the Buddha said something along the lines of like life is sort of suffering, right? That suffering is part of the experience. Now, I don't think he was saying that life in its totality is suffering, but he was pointing to the fact that the phenomenon of suffering is a regular occurrence to people who are not being responsible for their consciousness, for people that are not being self-aware of the processes and the phenomenon of how that suffering is taking place. And then his next principle was like, well, we can become aware of why and how things take place, and we can start to have some capability to be able to maneuver within that. And hopefully then we can move to the next stage, which is we can use skills and capabilities. We can be like meaningfully skilled to be able to change and undo some of these challenges of suffering, to move to our, let's say, final stage, if there is such a thing, or to be liberated or be a liberator of this situation that would otherwise be kind of constrained under, factors of suffering. So the first and foremost principle is to be somebody that is being really on a path of will to liberate themselves. Now, that can be driven by two primary forces: the primary force of pain and the primary force of desire. And I think both are significant, but ultimately life is both pain and desire, and we could say pleasure and pain, but in many ways we move towards the desire of what we want and move away from the things that we don't want. And pain, in some sense, or discomfort, is one of the primary kind of factors within that. So being aware of what it is that you don't want, being aware of what it is that you do want, and then aligning yourself towards those outcomes, that's one of these primary skills that we're going to start to work with first of all. Now, what it also starts to open up is that we are now working with understanding of what does it mean to be aware. Well, as a human being, we have thoughts, we have feelings, we have certain internal narrative layers of those thoughts and feelings that are basically the way that we construct them into our beliefs. And when we have an experience and then we categorize that experience, and then we process that categorization of experience as good or bad, we build a trance and we identify that was a good experience, that was a bad experience. I'm a person who enjoys this, I'm a person who doesn't enjoy this. And then we start to see life through those types of frames and those types of layers. So one of the things to recognize, if we really want to boil this down yet again, is like, okay, we're in a consciousness game of belief. We're in a consciousness game of levels of how the world is being created through story. And therefore, we're in this game on some level of we see the world as we see it, right? We don't see the world as it is necessarily. As a matter of fact, it's quite the feat and quite the spiritual attainment to see the world as it is. Despite the fact that we think that we do, we tend to experience the world through a lot of lenses of sensory input, particularly and specifically when we haven't really had a lot of raw, real, let's say, embodied experiences. Typically under the guidance and under the support of certain types of like frameworks and maybe even teachings. And I know myself, even if you do have, and we do have amazing insights and amazing trance states on a regular basis, even when we go to sleep at night, we're technically going through layers of these deep states of consciousness that are very meditative, but we don't register them because we don't necessarily have a context of measurement. We don't have a significance of meaning. Maybe we don't have a layer of reflection that then gives us like some sense of like, some sense of context around that. So once again, a lot of things that we could say to unpack within that, but really what we're unfolding here, which I hope people are getting, is like we're talking wizard business now, right? We're in the wizard seats and we're building this capability of living from the wizard's gate. Now, who is the wizard and what is the wizard's gate? The wizard's gate is this nexus of being and becoming and being in this space where consciousness is king, but you are able to work with it and negotiate it with it as a type of a kingdom. Now, even that's a narrative that I'm expressing here, but it's like a mytho-poetic narrative that hopefully captures some thought, it captures some feelings, it starts to capture an identity, which loops us back to where I was at before, is like, I would really love for listeners to start to realize like it's really cool to be a wizard. It's really powerful to want to be a master of your own attention. It's the most important, if not the only thing that's actually worth anything in this life, as everything keeps churning, changing, updating, rearranging, is to be some type of a center in this ability to play the game of life with multidimensionality, to approach the world from multiple layers. And we don't have to be hippies that believe in weird spirits or religious people who are particularly stuck in one ideology, or we don't have to be very strictly materialistic or even scientific about things. We get to use it all these days. We can be psychologically informed. We can be neuroscientifically informed. We can be spiritually informed from Eastern and Western esoteric sciences. We can use all these comprehensive things. And we also can just stay with the basics as well of just like, I'm working with my breath. I'm working with my attention. I'm working with my body. I'm working with my will. And that can create like a container of what's possible moving forward. So a lot to unpack in terms of like what kinds of toolkits, what kinds of choices, what kinds of games we could play from this place. But, this is it. Welcome to the Wizards Arena.
Yeah, and developing your consciousness toolkit. I think part of being more liberated is having such flexibility of mind, which gives you an anti-fragility to adapt with the times and take on this like radical pragmatism of being able to um, understand your thoughts and play with different thoughts, different mindsets of can you be the lion, the warrior? Can you get out of victim consciousness? And first you have to understand yourself. First you have to explore what's at play here to then attend to it with subtle modulating attentional move sets and these kind of things.
Mm.
yeah, being a wizard, it's a high level. It's yeah,
But at the same time, I mean, how else are we expected to live in this world of complexity in a way, right? So if we bring it back to a little bit about my story, the reason why I came to these complex worldviews, in many ways contradictory worldviews to the world I was brought up in,
yeah,
or worldviews that were not sustained or supported by the authority figures that were, my influences. The reason why I came to this is because what I was provided was not good enough. It wasn't satisfactory. It didn't give me the options. It didn't sustain me. It didn't free me from pain. It didn't give me the pathways. And if I just lived in what I knew and I followed what I was told, I never would have grown into the person that I've become. I never would have learnt healing arts. I never would have traveled the world. I never would have trained thousands of men. I never would have learned to climb into all these different these different like breakthroughs of barriers of different paradigms, whether that was like getting into different types of shamanism. And I've been into, shamanic practices for many decades now, and, taking ayahuasca dozens and dozens of times, traveling around the world, working with different energetic healers, also looking at different types of paradigms that come from like the world of modern like masculinity or modern humanity as well. So I mean, I sit here and I'm surrounded by screens and AI. So like I'm in this kind of cool, crazy world where I get to be this multidimensional approach agent that is really building a comprehensive story of the world. Now, what I would hope that this really means to people is that you can and you are allowed to quest for a superior operating system. You can and you are able to become somebody that is seeking to align to your landscape of inner capabilities and outer world capabilities with a different type of approach. And in many ways, you can start to create a story that makes sense for you, that is going to be a more rich story. So, as an example, right? Because I want to start planting some seeds and putting some ideas in that it might be curious and interesting to people. In the Western esoteric journeys of magic, one of the highest aims, or let's say one of the narratives and the purposes of the whole game, is to put the individual practitioner into a position where they are seeking to become at one with their higher guardian self, their conversation of the higher guardian angel, let's say. And this is somewhat termed like the daemon force. So what's the daemon? Not demon, daemon. Daemon is the higher intelligence, the genius, something inside of us that's actually this driving force. And if we pay attention, anybody that has a good serve of daemon force is somebody that's intrinsically dissatisfied with life, somebody that's highly adventurous, somebody that probably takes risks, somebody that wants to be in the fire of life, somebody in many ways, if they're not careful, will destroy themselves. They will do things that are going to be outrageous and maybe even against their own good well-being if they're not careful, because this spirit wants to know itself as fulfilled in all of these different types of experiences. And if it doesn't get channeled into this journey of initiation, which I believe a lot of men are actually really wanting and desiring, whether they consciously realize it or not, if it doesn't get channeled out effectively, it starts channeling inwards and becoming a sort of self-destructive tendency, a depressive tendency, a hopeless tendency, a helpless tendency. And therefore, constructing a path, let's say, or constructing a hopeful narrative and giving a type of like containment and a support to that possibility for a man, for a boy, for whoever needs it at whatever stage that they're at, can be a huge upliftment and a very big support to be able to become, this type of journeyman on this system. Now, once again, the Western esoteric system is all about doing the great work. What's the great work? Well, to bring heaven to earth, to turn yourself into some type of God. And that's a pretty big thing, right? And in many ways, you could say that's a heresy, especially from a perspectives of like a Christian-esque perspective. But then you think about it, what was Jesus's job? He was literally bringing heaven to earth as God-man. So it's like kind of ironic that the core icon of their story is literally that. He's a shamanic man. He's a bridge of heavenly consciousness into earth, and to be a mentor, to be a teacher, to be a bridge, ideally of higher principles of integrity, of love, and he had to go through adversity. And ideally he was in communion with these type of angelic entities. and these higher forces that were part of this story that ultimately was this kind of culmination of, consciousness that was doing this great work. And in some senses, all in the name of this type of like godhead of some type. Now, is that true? Well, I'm not here to say whether it's true or not, and some people would probably be offended if I didn't say it was true. But what is true is the fact that we create reality through meaning and through layers. And in many ways, these stories, which I am, I'm somebody who can step into and has experienced deep richness and deep respect and deep feelings of connection to Christian mysteries, for example. But I've also felt the same in terms of other alternative schools of thought, whether that's Buddhist or Taoist or Jewish, or even looking at different Western esoteric Hermetic systems, or even looking at it from a perspective of, like I was saying before, a chaos magic perspective, which ultimately is, part of what I do feel at home in, even though that's a title that is a bit vague and in many ways can be misrepresented because not a lot of people have, a real grasp of what that means. Plus, it's very individualistic. So in many ways, no two chaos magicians can really say what they even are to each other because it's kind of like a different type of like approach to the way that they're putting the whole story together. So long story short, having an approach of a holistic system that in many ways is giving you a framework so that you can understand yourself, so that you can understand the way that you interface with the world, and ultimately to give you a practical series of steps, things that you can do on a daily basis with your words, with your actions, with your personality, with your resources, with the ways in which you use the network around you. This is the game of life. It's what I call the inner game. It's what I made my whole life about these last like 2 decades, basically. Everything is about how to understand the context, the game, the capability of becoming somebody who is really in the operator seat of building their life almost like a kind of Lego builder of their own reality, understanding what's going on. And to just round that off, it's like if we bring in this concept of we're on a journey of some type of great work and we are in a communion with different types of intelligences. And there is some type of higher creative force, which you could call a godhead or a creator force or some type of hyper intelligence that's operating. And then we are some type of student that's experiencing some alignments to this that is both chaotic and ordered. And in many ways, we all do have, and I do believe that we have a type of like intelligence that is actually part of our guidance system that's working with us. And it does miraculously synchronize us and open us to all kinds of different steps and capabilities inside of our life if we are allowing ourselves, or we are open to experiencing what are the possibilities of opening ourselves to that, to saying yes to maybe not knowing. And this is where it becomes somewhat of a game of belief, a game of faith, a game of we have to create it in our imagination before we can have it. And then it becomes this interesting type of like, feedback loop and experience. And, once again, I want to unpack more of this because there's a lot of things to say. And ultimately, this is an invitation. Like, this is an invitation to anybody who's listening to start to be more open to building their own operating system, to being more self-aware of where they're coming from in their own experimentation, in their own desire to get out of their exasperation of suffering and to move towards acquisition of assets, of capabilities, to move towards, fulfillment of their power through the development of consciousness, the development of skill, the development of this inner game that can then represent and show itself in the outer game of their lifestyle. So that's what I got to say for about that.
Just like to express to the audience that there is radical potential in everyone to have to access a wider array of the state space of consciousness, to see things in many different ways, that you can broaden your horizons of experience, and subsequently you begin formulating higher order sort of patterns of generally how things go down, how this works. Reality seems to make more sense. Other people make more sense. You make more sense to yourself. And then there is, instead of being less ensnared, or instead of being more ensnared in the prisons of your own mind matrix, you have developed your consciousness toolkit and have many more ways to play in this space, to get out of certain pitfalls and reorient and find just what works, like what what helps you feel more integral and arrive at your deep-seated desires and what you attract and what's sort of internally sourced and outsourced and all these ways. And so then life just becomes way more complex and beautiful, and you explore the array of potential experiences. And this thing is magical beyond belief. So much so it's ineffable. It really cannot be surmised and packaged into any one, formula of everything.
Love it. Thank you, Roger, for all your wonderful wisdoms, man. Thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts in this space. This is the first round of what we're going to be calling, or I'm going to be calling, Wizard Talks, because I realize that I have these great opportunities to talk to great guys like Roger. And I just want everybody to be aware, Roger is a very serious practitioner in this field. He knows what he's talking about. He teaches people. He has a website. He has a background in this. He's a scientifically researched and highly capable meditator. He goes off and hangs out with many great people in different places to find out the truth in different monasteries. I'd love to hear all about that in future. But if anybody's really interested in finding out about what he's about, you can go to rogerthisdell.com. And we'll put that in the show notes at the bottom here as well, so people can check that out. And by all means, reach out to him, let him know that that you're interested in his work. And yeah, let's send a bit of love out there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roger. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. May all our dreams come true, everybody. I'll see you guys on the other side. What's up, ninjas? Thanks for watching the video. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this material so that I can keep on growing this amazing channel. And if you'd like to get the help that I can offer, I would like you to check out the link in the description. Go to my website and you will be able to find amazing limited time offers to help you to be able to break through and make the changes that you would really like to have in your life. Until then, this is the Shaman saying peace out. May all your dreams come true, and I'll see you guys on the other side.